The dusty shelves of the video rental store had seen better days, with the boxes of VHS tapes starting to show their age. Sarah sat behind the counter, twirling her pen in her hand as she watched the few customers browsing the aisles. It was a slow day, with the occasional chime of the doorbell signaling the arrival of a new patron. Sarah was lost in her thoughts when her boss, Mr. Thompson, approached her with a video cassette in his hand.
"Sarah, can you do me a favor?"
he asked, holding out the tape.
"This was returned to the store, but it's not one of our tapes. Can you watch it and let me know if we should order more copies?"
Sarah took the tape from Mr. Thompson, examining the faded label on the front. It was a plain white label with black marker writing that read "Do Not Watch." The warning only intrigued Sarah more, and she couldn't resist the temptation to see what was on the tape.
"Sure, no problem,"
she said, hiding her excitement as she pocketed the tape. Sarah waited until her shift was over and she was alone in her apartment before popping the tape into her VCR. The sound of the tape being pulled into the machine filled the room as Sarah settled onto the couch. The screen flickered to life, and Sarah watched in anticipation as the first images appeared. At first, the tape seemed to be a collection of home videos with a family at a beach, a birthday party, and other mundane scenes. But as the tape progressed, the images became darker and more disturbing. Sarah watched in horror as a figure in a dark cloak appeared on the screen, whispering words she couldn't understand. The figure seemed to be staring directly at Sarah through the screen, and she felt a chill run down her spine. The tape continued to play, and Sarah found herself unable to look away. The images became more surreal and nightmarish, with twisted landscapes and grotesque creatures appearing on the screen. The sounds coming from the television were otherworldly, and Sarah felt like she was being drawn into a dark world of terror and supernatural forces. Finally, the tape ended with a final message scrawled on the screen: "Do not watch again." But it was too late. Sarah was already under the spell of the tape and couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The tape had become an obsession, and Sarah knew that she needed to find out more about it before it consumed her completely. As Sarah turned off the TV, she couldn't help but wonder what dark forces had been unleashed by watching the tape. She knew that she had opened a door to a world beyond her imagination, and she was powerless to stop the horrors that were sure to follow. Sarah couldn't get the strange tape out of her head. She knew she had to find out where it came from and who had made it. She started her investigation at the video rental store, hoping to find some clues about the tape's origins. But Mr. Thompson didn't have any answers for her.
"I'm sorry, Sarah,"
he said, shaking his head.
"I have no idea where that tape came from. It wasn't in our inventory, and I don't know how it ended up here."
Sarah wasn't deterred. She knew there had to be a way to track down the source of the tape. She spent hours online searching for any information she could find about it. She scoured message boards and forums, looking for anyone who had seen a similar tape or had any information about it. But no one seemed to have any answers. As she continued her search, Sarah began to experience strange occurrences around her. Objects would move on their own, and she heard strange whispers in the middle of the night. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, watching her every move. One night, Sarah received a mysterious message on her computer. It was an email from an unknown sender with a simple message: "I know what you've seen. Meet me at the abandoned church on 3rd Street at midnight." Sarah hesitated, unsure if she should trust the message, but her curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to investigate. She arrived at the church just before midnight, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty street. As she approached the church, Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The building was dark and foreboding, with broken windows and overgrown vines covering the walls. But she pushed her fear aside and entered the church. The inside of the church was even more eerie than the outside. The pews were overturned, and there were strange symbols scrawled on the walls. Sarah saw a figure in the shadows, and she froze in terror. But as the figure stepped into the light, Sarah saw that it was a man in a hooded robe.
"Hello, Sarah,"
the man said, his voice low and ominous.
"I see that you have seen the tape."
Sarah nodded, unable to speak.
"The tape is a gateway."
The man continued.
"It leads to a world beyond our own, a world of darkness and terror. But it is not too late for you. You can still turn back and forget what you have seen."
Sarah knew that she could never forget what she had seen. She was too deep into the mystery of the tape to turn back now.
I need to know more.
She said, her voice shaking.
Who made the tape? Where did it come from?
The man in the robe smiled, revealing a row of sharp teeth.
"That is a question for another time, Sarah. For now, you must go. The tape is watching, and it is not pleased with your curiosity."
Sarah left the abandoned church, her mind racing with questions and fear. She knew that she had uncovered something beyond her comprehension, something that could threaten her very existence. But she couldn't stop now. She had to keep investigating no matter the cost. As Sarah walked home from the abandoned church, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder but saw no one. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. When she arrived home, Sarah immediately went to bed, exhausted from the night's events. But as soon as she closed her eyes, she heard a strange buzzing sound, like a swarm of bees. She opened her eyes and saw that the room was filled with a thick fog. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. She couldn't see anything through the dense fog, but she felt a presence in the room with her. She heard footsteps moving across the floor, coming closer to her bed.
Who's there?
She called out, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer, only the sound of footsteps getting louder. Sarah reached for her phone, but it wasn't where she had left it. She fumbled in the fog, searching for her phone, but her hand touched something cold and slimy. She pulled back, and the fog cleared for a moment, revealing a ghostly hand reaching for her. Sarah screamed and scrambled out of bed, running for the door. But as she reached the door, it slammed shut, trapping her in the room. She pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the fog dissipated, and Sarah found herself standing in the middle of an empty field. She looked around, disoriented, trying to figure out where she was. But there was nothing in sight, only endless fields stretching out in all directions. Sarah heard a voice behind her and turned to see the man in the hooded robe standing there.
"You shouldn't have come here,"
he said, his voice cold and emotionless. Sarah felt a surge of anger.
What is going on?
She demanded.
Why are you doing this to me?
The man stepped closer, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light.
"The tape is not meant for mortal eyes,"
He said.
"You have disturbed the balance, and now you must pay the price."
Sarah tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, unable to escape. The man raised his hand, and Sarah felt a blast of energy hit her. She screamed in agony, feeling her body being ripped apart. When she opened her eyes again, Sarah was back in her room. The fog was gone, and everything seemed normal. But she knew that things would never be the same. She had seen too much, and now she was caught up in something beyond her control. Sarah vowed to keep investigating, no matter the danger. She knew that the tape held secrets that could change everything, and she was determined to uncover them. But she also knew that the consequences could be deadly. The tape was watching, and it was not pleased. After the terrifying experience in her bedroom, Sarah knew she had to act fast. She called up her friend and fellow video store employee, Jake, and told him everything that had happened. Jake was skeptical at first, but when he heard the fear in Sarah's voice, he knew that something was seriously wrong.
"Okay, I'll meet you at the store."
He said.
"We'll figure this out together.
When Sarah arrived at the video store, she found Jake waiting for her outside. They went inside and locked the door behind them. Sarah pulled out the tape and put it in the VCR. As the video started playing, Sarah and Jake watched in horror as the images became more and more disturbing. The hooded figure appeared on screen, speaking in a language neither of them could understand. The room began to fill with a thick fog, and Sarah and Jake could feel a cold presence in the room with them. Suddenly, the hooded figure stepped out of the TV screen and into the room. Sarah and Jake backed away, but the figure continued to approach them, its eyes glowing with a malevolent energy. Sarah and Jake knew they had to act fast. Sarah grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it at the figure, but the lamp went right through it, as if it wasn't really there. Jake grabbed a nearby broomstick and swung it at the figure, but it too had no effect. The figure let out a guttural growl and lunged at Sarah. She closed her eyes, waiting for the impact, but instead felt a sudden rush of heat. When she opened her eyes, she saw that the figure was gone and the tape had stopped playing. Sarah and Jake breathed a sigh of relief, but they knew that they had to get rid of the tape once and for all. They took the tape and burned it in a fire outside the store, watching as the flames consumed it. As the last embers of the tape burned away, Sarah and Jake felt a weight lift off their shoulders. They knew that the danger was finally gone and they could return to their normal lives. But as they turned to go back inside, they heard a faint buzzing sound, like a swarm of bees. They looked around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. They shrugged it off and went back inside, thinking that they had finally put the tape behind them. But little did they know, the tape was not truly gone. It had left its mark on them, and they would never be the same again. The buzzing sound would continue to haunt them, a reminder of the horrors they had faced and the darkness that still lingered in the world. Days had passed since Sarah and Jake burned the tape, and life had returned to a semblance of normalcy. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She found herself jumping at every little noise, and the buzzing sound that had plagued her since the encounter with the tape had grown louder and more persistent. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, that she was overreacting. But deep down, she knew that something was still wrong. She confided in Jake, but he too had been experiencing strange occurrences since the encounter with the tape. They both felt a sense of dread that they couldn't shake. One evening, Sarah was closing up the video store when she noticed a strange figure outside, standing in the shadows. It was the hooded figure from the tape, and it was watching her. She froze, unable to move or speak, as the figure slowly approached her. As it came closer, Sarah could feel the heat emanating from it, and she could see its glowing eyes fixated on her. She knew that she was in danger, but she was in danger, but she was powerless to do anything about it. Just as the figure was about to grab her, Jake burst through the door brandishing a baseball bat. He swung at the figure, but it vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a lingering smell of smoke. Sarah and Jake knew that they couldn't go on like this. They needed help, and they needed it fast. They contacted a local paranormal investigator who agreed to meet with them at the video store. The investigator arrived later that day, and Sarah and Jake showed him the tape, explaining everything that had happened. The investigator watched the tape, but he could not decipher the language or the symbols on it. He suggested that they take the tape to a linguist and a historian who might be able to shed some light on its origins. As the days went by, Sarah and Jake waited anxiously for the results of the investigation. They tried to go about their daily lives, but the buzzing sound and the feeling of being watched never left them. They were constantly on edge, waiting for the hooded figure to return. Finally, the linguist and historian came back with their findings. They had traced the tape's origins to an ancient civilization that had worshipped a dark god of chaos and destruction. The symbols on the tape were part of a ritual that was used to summon this god, and the hooded figure was one of its manifestations. Sarah and Jake knew what they had to do. They had to destroy the tape once and for all and put an end to the cycle of terror that it had unleashed. They gathered all the information they had and made a plan to confront the dark god and banish it from their world. In the dead of night, they returned to the site where they had burned the tape. They stood before the ashes, reciting ancient incantations and performing a ritual that would send the god back to the depths of the underworld. The buzzing sound grew louder and more intense, but Sarah and Jake held firm, determined to see it through to the end. Finally, there was a blinding flash of light, and the buzzing sound stopped. Sarah and Jake knew that they had succeeded, that the darkness had been banished, and that they could finally move on with their lives. As they walked away from the site, they felt a sense of relief and gratitude. They had faced unspeakable horrors, but they had emerged victorious. They knew that they would never forget what had happened to them, but they were ready to face whatever the future held, together